Into the wild blue yonder, climbing high into the sun.
These women saw an opportunity, first of all, because they had the passion for flying. The opportunity to serve their country at the same time and use that passion was extraordinary.
To help fight for their country and ultimately prove that women were just as capable as men, the WASP established an experimental program in 1943 that operated for roughly 2 years before being disbanded by the U.S. military. Not only did the women Air Force service pilots' involvement with flying aircraft in World War II defy military-based gender stereotypes, but it paved a path for women to gain equality to men in all aspects of life in the future. Pearl Harbor was bombed by the Japanese on December 7, 1941. In response, the U.S. broke its isolationist policy and entered the war, fighting alongside the Allied powers to defeat the Axis powers. There was a growing demand for pilots, and the number of qualified males was insufficient to supply the Allied powers. The men needed trained flyers to take their places so that they could be released for combat duty overseas. This need gave way for the ideas of two remarkable women, Jacqueline Cochran and Nancy Harkness Love. Independent of one another, Cochran and Harkness each proposed that the U.S. recruit female pilots. Jackie Cochran, who learned to fly planes to expand her cosmetics business, took her interest in flying aircraft to new heights. Prior to World War II, she sought aid from Eleanor Roosevelt to establish her own non-combat division in the U.S. Army Air Force. Because Cochran's idea required approval from the strictly bound military, and Roosevelt alone would not be able to put her plan into action, all she could offer was inspiration for the women. Women pilots, in this particular case, are a weapon waiting to be used. At the beginning of World War II, Cochran proposed her idea to General Henry Arnold. He said he wasn't sure whether a slip of a girl could fight the controls of a B-17 in heavy weather. Instead, he suggested she ferry planes with the British Royal Air Force. Cochran took his advice and left for Britain. 2 years later, Pearl Harbor was bombed, and Harkness provided an almost identical idea to a colonel of the Army Air Force. The colonel relayed the message to the Air Transport Command commander, who at last gained approval from General Arnold. Accordingly, the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron was established at Newcastle Army Air Force Base in Delaware. Outraged that she had not been involved, Cochran demanded General Arnold provide her with an active role in the Air Force. He gave his approval for her to start the Women's Flying Training Detachment to train females for flight in non-combat domestic missions. In 1943, the two groups merged into WASP, the Women Air Force Service Pilots, with its base in Avenger Field, Texas. Cochran served as the head of the program, while Harkness led the ferrying division. After news spread of the establishment of WASP, 25,000 women with flying experience applied for positions in the program, eager to contribute to the war effort. Of these 25,000 women, 1,102 graduated from training and were sent for ferrying duty, moving aircraft from factories to Army bases stationed across the United States. Each graduate received a commercial pilot's license and an instrument rating. Though ferrying aircraft was the only thing the WASP planned to do, they ended up achieving much more. The typical day's training for an up-and-coming WASP was rigorous. Their day began at 6 a.m. and ended at 10 p.m., the same as their male counterparts. A woman applying for a position with the WASPs had to be in tip-top shape. She was typically required to be between 21 and 35 years old, have uncorrected 20/20 vision, and be at least 5'4", although some exceptions were made. The women studied weather, math, physics, navigation, Morse code, meteorology, and were instructed to fly in linked trainers and advanced aircraft. Furthermore, the WASPs were required to march and complete physical and drill training.
All of the students are between 18 and a half and 35 years of age and have at least a high school education. Before entering the program, they have to pass the rigid Army 64 physical examination given all aviation cadets. Little girls flying big planes need not only the brain power, but the physical strength. And arm and leg muscles must be developed before they can roll an Army trainer properly.
Aside from ferrying planes and transporting war supplies, the WASP tested newly overhauled planes and towed targets for men's shooting practice, a very dangerous job.
Well, we delivered planes and we flew flags in the back for them to practice shooting, and occasionally we'd make a turn and it wasn't in the book, or it was a mistake, and you could get shot because they used real ammunition.
Some WASP members even flight tested dangerous bombers that male cadets were too afraid to fly. Colonel Tibbets of the Army Air Force credited the women. They did the job, and I don't know how we could have gotten to fly B-29 airplanes without them. The women eventually were trained to fly all types of military aircraft, whereas men had only been trained for one or two, making female pilots more qualified. Each woman in the WASP program was required to extensively practice takeoffs, landings, snap rolls, parachute bailouts, night flying, cross-country flying, and aerobatics. Though many doubted the women, as according to gender roles at the time, the women ultimately endured a far lower accident rate when flying than the men in the Air Force, once again proving their qualifications. While WASP training gave its graduates certifications equal to those of their male counterparts, male pilots maintained their higher status, as much greater restrictions were placed on the women, even before entering the program. For example, men who had dropped out of high school were permitted, but women were required to have at least finished high school to apply. Women were only permitted to fly small airplanes, while the men were not limited in their choice of aircraft. Additionally, the women involved in the program were not given military status, excluding them from certain benefits. Although they were paid slightly more per month than their male counterparts, they had to pay for housing, clothing, food, insurance, medical care, and burial services, while men didn't have to.
And if one of them was killed in service, the gals took up a collection in a hat, past the hat, to ship the body home. And they were not allowed to have a flag on their casket because they were not part of the military. So they had no insurance, no benefits, and no flag.
As the commotion of war died down, the men were able to come home from combat and take back their positions that the women had upheld for the time being. Although they made a significant impact on the victory of the Allied powers, men urged the women to return to their proper place, the kitchen. Another argument, published by popular women's magazines and news articles, claimed that an absence of a mother in the home could cause juvenile delinquency. Many men tried to convince women to give up their efforts, believing the women posed a threat to their dominance, not only in the Air Force, but in other walks of life. In an effort to preserve the social order, many men failed to credit the women involved for their outstanding efforts. With all this outrage among the male cadets, the Army Air Force concluded that they would end the WASP program, since there were enough men that returned and were willing to fight. Some women begged to stay while others volunteered to work for no wages, but their offers were turned down. At the end of 1944, a graduation ceremony was held for the last class of WASP, which celebrated the numerous accomplishments these remarkable women achieved in so little time. At their graduation, General Arnold credited the women. "You and more than 900 of your sisters have flown wingtip to wingtip with your brothers. I salute you and all WASP. We of the Army Air Force are proud of you. We will never forget our debt to you." But they did forget their debt. After the graduation ceremony in 1944, the history of WASP was concealed from the eyes of the public for over 30 years. Their records were marked classified and hidden away in archives. As a result, the contribution of WASP was left out of official World War II history in its time. For many years, the rights of women who served the WASP were hotly debated, but they eventually reached a standstill. The WASP were finally recognized for their service and given veteran status by Jimmy Carter in 1977. In 1984, the living members of WASP were honored further, receiving World War II victory medals. As late as after the year 2000, a law was passed allowing WASP to be buried at Arlington National Cemetery with military honors. In addition, the WASP were given congressional gold medals. In 2015, John McHugh repealed the law granting the WASP full military honors, claiming that the women did not meet the requirements other people had met in order to claim veteran status. Just 3 short years ago, President Obama signed a law guaranteeing the WASP full military honors once and for all. The WASP program greatly contributed to the success of World War II, as well as the progression towards gender equality. Not only did each and every woman stay true to her country and use her patriotism to gain victory for the U.S., but she proved that she wasn't too fragile or simple-minded to handle jobs that were previously considered only suitable for men. The amount of work each woman did stumped many men, and made them rethink the way they had been treating women. Our society needs to be better educated about the challenges women face in establishing WASP and about the important contributions they made to U.S. history. Due to the concealment of the history of the WASP program in the past, it remains historically obscure today. Each and every one of these women deserve recognition for their outstanding work. Not only did they help the U.S. win World War II, the WASP set a precedent for the women of the future to advocate for gender equality.